Hello, Bobcats. Welcome back to Student versus Professor. Today we have lecturer Austin Cook from the Department of Communications and student Jack Licata. Welcome, guys. All right, Austin, in your experience, does the traditional lecture method adequately prepare students for real-world challenges and workplace demands?
Well, I would say that in a traditional lecture environment, it depends on how you view a traditional lecture. For me, when I went to college, a traditional lecture was a combination of a normal lecture where the professor talks to you about all the information that they know and love, provides you with a lot of context, examples, so on and so forth. But for me, the important part of it is also the discussion, a way to kind of explore what you've learned and how you've learned it, how we got to this point. So I think that from a traditional lecture standpoint, if you're thinking of like, you just show up and then get talked at for 2 hours, not necessarily, but if you add new elements to it and you make sure that there's an open forum for questions and discussion, I think that it absolutely can still hold up, especially once you get a good kind of knowledge base and a good foundation. So that way, when you do move into the more practical elements of what you are learning, you feel more prepared and you have a good base in theory and also just overall education, especially within your department.
Awesome. Jack, what do you think?
I feel like with the introduction of technology, we've moved past that traditional lecture structure. I feel like it depends on the professor, and it really, in my experience, depends on the topic. Like for a history class, having a professor lecture, give dates, write that stuff down, and show us those dates on the board works better. But for like a language class, because I'm a language major, practical application is what works better. Conversations, having us answer questions. So I feel like we've moved from a standard traditional lecture because of how much more we can study now and how different each, subject is. Like the way you would teach a language class and the way you would teach a science class are two completely different things. So it's not fair to make a generalization, at least in my opinion.
And what do you think? Do you think there are different classes where different methods are needed?
Oh, absolutely. We don't have labs in like film and TV production where I predominantly teach. We have a production lab of some sort, so I know I almost kind of contradicted myself there just a little bit. But in practical methods, like if you're in history, like yes, your focus is on the knowledge and then your analysis of that knowledge. In language, you need to speak the language and speak with someone in order to actually learn that language a little bit more efficiently. Now, in languages, it's not just speaking, you're also writing and you're learning about the culture and context of it. But since technology has advanced so much, as you mentioned, like really the important parts of different majors, it just depends on what you're looking at. Like in theory and research classes, yes, predominantly having a lecture where you're talking with each other and talking with the class and asking questions, very effective. But in other languages, maybe it's not as important. So I think it really does depend on the context.
Awesome. And Jack, how does the traditional lecture style system accommodate the varying classroom speeds and styles of students within a single classroom?
I feel like there are so many different types of learners nowadays that it is a amalgamation of the professor, the content that's being taught, and how they want to teach that. Like I'm more of an audiovisual learner, so I need to see what I'm hearing. So like if a professor is just standing there with the whiteboard and just writing stuff down, I'm not going to retain any of that information. But if they have a PowerPoint up and they are making notes based off that PowerPoint on the board and then having that PowerPoint available for us on D2L after the fact, I'm more likely to retain the information. But then again, it's also different with every subject. Like you can't apply the same methods of teaching for a history class that you would a language class and then a science class or a math class because there's such a difference. But I feel like it's very hard to accommodate for everybody. But I feel like nowadays that there's this almost gray area or middle ground that the professor can sit in to where everybody is learning just enough to retain just enough information in class without having to every day look over the textbook or look over the PowerPoints that are being left online just because no one person learns the same way. It's the professors are set up to both succeed and fail when it comes to that kind of stuff, at least in my opinion.
All right, Austin, how does the traditional lecture method address the challenges of student disengagement and attention span?
So I think especially in today's environments, a lot of times people need something added to the lecture to keep them engaged. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think a lot of times, from different generations especially, people will be like, well, kids these days, it's a different environment. Like, like back in my day, it was so different. And the thing is that change is not necessarily bad. And I think when you take elements of the traditional lecture and you apply it in different methods to try and make it as engaging as possible for different people, it makes it a lot easier for people to actually communicate that, not only with their professor, but also with each other. Because at the end of the day, like, the professor can provide you with all this knowledge, but their job goes beyond that as well, too. Like, they actually need to interact with the question and with the student and kind of be able to answer that context or answer that question on a certain level. And trying to find a way that works for everybody, like, obviously not everybody's going to have a perfect method of learning, but if you create an open space for where people can actually look at it and go, okay, well, this one wasn't necessarily the best for me. It's like flashcards. Not everybody uses flashcards. I didn't use flashcards, but I know a lot of people who it worked really well for them. And if you give them the option of having that as part of their education, as part of their kind of lecture, that's fantastic. But I also think that the material, they shouldn't be based on their memory of the material, but that they should have the ability to actually interact with that material, like uploading PowerPoints to D2L, having them available for people. I think that's the most important part. It's not only just the lecture itself, it's one part of the equation, but the learning after the fact and the engagement after the fact is equally as important.
Jack, what do you think?
I mean, I couldn't agree more, to be honest with you. I mean, I know personally, if a professor is going to sit there and lecture for 2 hours, I'll last maybe 30 minutes before I start looking at something else on my computer or take my phone out and look at something. And I have no shame in admitting that, because it's also not fair to expect students to be engaged for 2 straight hours of just someone droning on. It's not practical, because we as humans need to constantly be stimulated. Otherwise, we'll focus on other stuff. And then you also have to take into account people who have learning disabilities, who have ADHD, who have dyslexia. Like, there's so many factors to where we've moved past the point of a generalization.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for coming and for your time. Back to you.